Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going way back to World War I and all the stuff that happened afterward, and we're going to use the American Yop to help us. It's a history book, but not your typical boring one.
Yeah, it's different because it has all these different voices, so you get a much better picture of how this one event changed everything.
Exactly. I'm guessing you want to go beyond just the battles, right?
hmm
To see how this war changed society and politics in ways we still see today.
Exactly. And there are going to be some surprises along the way. Like, did you know that the U.S. got involved in the war partly because of a secret telegram that was trying to get Mexico to turn against the U.S.? And then there was a deadly pandemic, the Spanish flu, that killed even more people than the war itself.
Wait, Mexico. Okay, now you've got me hooked. Let's go back a bit and set the scene. The American Yop says that Europe was like a powder keg ready to blow up before the war even started. All these empires were fighting for power, especially Germany with Kaiser Wilhelm II at the helm.
Wilhelm II is interesting. He was obsessed with the British Empire, which led to this big naval rivalry. Germany was building up its navy, expanding its colonies, basically trying to take over from Britain as the top dog. Meanwhile, you have the U.S. pretty much on its own, focused on its industries, and with a military that was really behind the times.
So it's like these two completely different worlds about to collide.
Hmm.
But what I found interesting is how the American Yop brings in the U.S. intervention in Mexico during this time. It's like a prequel to the main event.
Totally. It was like a testing ground for new military technology and tactics, and it showed that the U.S. wasn't as isolated as people thought. Actually, the U.S. getting involved in Mexico had a big impact on relations between the two countries, something we still see today.
See, that's what I'm talking about. It's not just dates and battles. It's understanding the long-term effects, even on things that seem unrelated.
Exactly. And here's something else for you. Those events in Mexico, which seem so far away from what was going on in Europe, they actually gave the U.S. military experience that would be super important when they joined the war. It's like foreshadowing.
Okay, so Europe is on the verge of war. The U.S. is testing its military strength in Mexico. Then, as the American Yop puts it, boom, World War I starts.
Ah,
They say the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the trigger.
but it wasn't just some random act. Europe at the time was a web of alliances, all meant to keep the peace. This assassination, it was like a tiny spark that set the whole thing off.
A domino effect.
Exactly. Austria-Hungary goes after Serbia, Russia steps in to protect Serbia, Germany backs up Austria-Hungary, and then Great Britain jumps in to support its allies. All of a sudden, the whole continent's at war.
And the American Yop doesn't try to hide how horrible this war was.
Yeah.
They talk about how brutal trench warfare was, the huge numbers of casualties, just massive destruction.
It was a new kind of war, with new technology that led to a lot of death. Millions of young men died in those muddy trenches, sometimes only gaining a few yards.
It's hard to imagine. So in the middle of all this, the U.S. says it's neutral. But the American Yop points out that staying neutral was pretty much impossible.
Right. The U.S. was doing a lot of business with the Allies, especially Great Britain. They were sending them food, weapons, all kinds of important stuff.
So even though they weren't fighting, they were already in it pretty deep. Makes you wonder if they could have stayed out of it.
That's a great question. And as we'll see, a few things happened that made it even harder for America to stay neutral.
So it's this balancing act, trying to stay neutral while the world is at war. What were some of those things the American Yop talks about that pushed the U.S. closer to getting involved?
One big thing was Germany's submarine warfare. They were sinking ships, even ones with passengers, without any warning.
And that's where the Lusitania comes in, right?
Yeah. The Lusitania, it was a British passenger ship, and it had over 100 Americans on board. And when it was sunk, it was a big deal. It got people in the U.S. really angry and fueled a lot of anti-German feelings.
It's hard to imagine how shocked and scared people must have been. But even then, it wasn't a sure thing that the U.S. would go to war, was it?
No, not really. But then you have the Zimmerman telegram. The American Yelp makes this event sound really exciting. It's like something out of a spy movie.
Okay, remind me about that telegram. High school history was a while ago.
Okay, imagine this. Germany is realizing they're not doing so well in the war, so they send this secret telegram to Mexico. They want Mexico to be their ally against the U.S. They even promised that if Mexico joined the war on their side, they would help them get back the land they lost to the U.S. in the Mexican-American War.
That's crazy. What a risky move.
It was a huge mistake. British intelligence intercepted that telegram and decoded it, and when they told everyone what was in it, the American public pretty much decided they wanted war.
I bet. It's like they poked the bear one too many times. So 1917 comes around, and the U.S. officially joins the war. But the American Yawp points out that America was totally not ready for a war this big.
It was like they had to create an army from nothing. They went from just volunteers to having a draft, the Selective Service Act. Just imagine trying to organize an entire country for war. What a huge task.
It must have been so chaotic.
Yeah.
But didn't the American Yawp mention something about them using intelligence tests on the new recruits? That seems kind of strange.
It is strange, but it also shows us what people were thinking back then. They used these tests to try and figure out how smart recruits were and what jobs in the military they would be good at. But the thing is, the results were often wrong. They actually showed more about the biases of the people who made the tests than about the actual abilities of the recruits. Like, people who had just immigrated or who were from the countryside, they often scored lower even if they would have been great soldiers.
That makes you think about how we decide who is intelligent, right? And how those ideas can be influenced by biases based on social class and culture.
For sure. And it reminds us that even during war, when everyone's supposed to be united, social divisions and inequalities don't just disappear.
And speaking of inequalities, the American Yawp talks about what it was like for black soldiers during World War I. It doesn't sound like they were treated fairly.
No, they weren't. Black soldiers faced discrimination and segregation even when they were putting their lives on the line for their country. They were given the worst jobs, they weren't allowed to move up in rank, and they were treated badly because of their race.
It shows that the fight for equality and justice wasn't over, even when the country was fighting a war for democracy overseas. Kind of hypocritical, right?
Totally. And, this fight for equality in the military would actually help start the civil rights movement later on. It's important to remember that war affects a lot more than just what happens on the battlefield. It changes every part of society, and it forces people to deal with the problems and contradictions within their own country.
Okay, so we've got this giant war machine running both in the war and back home. What was life like for everyday Americans during this time? The American Yawp says things changed a lot, didn't they?
It was a complete transformation. The whole country had to adapt to a wartime economy. They had to ration food and fuel. Factories started making things for the war effort, and there was propaganda everywhere.
Propaganda, you mean like posters and slogans and stuff?
More than that, the American Yawp talks about this huge government campaign to control what people thought and to get them to support the war. They even had a special group called the Creel Committee that used everything from posters and pamphlets to movies and speeches to make the enemy seem evil and to promote patriotism.
Wow, like the first big PR campaign. I guess in wartime, controlling information becomes really important. Did everyone just go along with it?
Not everyone. The American Yawp also talks about how patriotism during wartime had a bad side. They mention the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which were used to stop anyone who was against the war from speaking out.
So freedom of speech was basically limited in the name of national security. It reminds us that even in democracies, war can lead to limits on personal freedoms.
It's a tough balance to strike. How do you protect the country while also protecting individual rights? It's something we're still talking about today.
Totally. But even with all the restrictions and sacrifices, the American Yawp also talks about some good changes that came out of this period, especially for women.
Right, because so many men were away fighting, women had to take on jobs that were usually considered men's work. They worked in factories, on ships, in offices. They were nurses, ambulance drivers. They even operated telephone switchboards for the military. They were called "Hello Girls."
So the war gave women this unexpected chance to show what they could do and challenge those old ideas about what women could and couldn't do.
Exactly. And even though some of those gains were lost later on, the war definitely helped to move things forward for women's suffrage and their fight for equality.
It shows that even during a time of conflict, there could be progress and positive change. It's like a complicated tapestry, with threads of both good and bad woven together.
I like that way of putting it. And as we get to the end of the war, we'll see how those threads continue to weave together, shaping the world in ways that are still felt today.
So the war is still going on, everything's changing, and then 1918 arrives. The American Yawp makes it seem like when American troops got to the Western Front, it was a big turning point, like it boosted everyone's spirits and helped the Allies win in the end.
Yeah, having those fresh American soldiers and all their supplies definitely made a difference. But what's interesting is that the American Yawp doesn't spend a lot of time talking about the battles. Instead, they focus on something even worse, the Spanish flu.
Oh, right, you mentioned that before. A worldwide pandemic happening right in the middle of a world war. That's just crazy.
It really makes you think sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones you can't even see. The Spanish flu spread through armies, cities, everywhere, killing millions and millions of people all over the world.
Millions. You're saying it killed more people than the war itself?
It did. The numbers are hard to believe. The American Yop really emphasizes how terrible it was. Think about it. The world is already struggling because of the war, and then this invisible killer comes along and makes everything so much worse. It shows how connected the world is, how something happening in one place can affect everyone.
It's a scary thought, especially after what we've all been through recently with the pandemic. It makes you realize how fragile life is, how even when people are celebrating a victory, there's still so much sadness and loss.
For sure. And it also shows how important things like public health, working together as a global community, and scientific progress are when we're facing these kinds of threats.
Okay, so the war finally ends, the pandemic fades away, and then there's this huge job of rebuilding and trying to create peace. The American Yop talks about President Woodrow Wilson and his big idea for lasting peace, his famous 14 points.
Wilson was a real idealist. He wanted a world where countries worked together, were honest with each other, and protected each other. His 14 points weren't just nice ideas, they were real suggestions for things like freedom of the seas, getting rid of weapons, and the biggest one, creating a League of Nations.
That sounds great, but was it really possible? Could those ideas actually work in a world that had just been through such a horrible war?
That's the question. The American Yop takes us inside the Paris Peace Conference, where all the winners of the war met to decide on the terms of the peace treaty. And let's just say it wasn't all smooth sailing.
I'm sure there were some big personalities and different goals clashing at that table.
Definitely. You had the French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, who wanted to punish Germany and make them pay for everything. Then there was the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, who cared more about keeping Britain powerful and getting economic benefits. And in the middle of it all was Wilson, trying to push his vision for a fairer and more peaceful world.
It sounds like he had a really tough job.
Yeah.
So how did it turn out? Did Wilson get his League of Nations?
Well, the Treaty of Versailles that they came up with was a bit of a mixed bag. It did create the League of Nations, which was a win for Wilson. But it also made Germany pay a lot of money, changed country borders, and basically set the stage for more conflicts later on.
So not really a peaceful peace.
Yeah, you could say that. And to make things worse, when Wilson went back to the U.S., people in the Senate, especially the ones who wanted to stay out of other countries' business, really didn't like the treaty.
So even though the U.S. was a big part of winning the war, they ended up rejecting the peace treaty.
That's right. The U.S. Senate wouldn't approve the Treaty of Versailles, which meant the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. It was a huge disappointment for Wilson and his hopes for a world where countries work together, and it had a big impact on what happened later on.
It makes you wonder how things might have gone differently if the U.S. had been part of the League. Could they have stopped World War II, or at least made things less chaotic afterwards?
Historians are still arguing about that one. But one thing the American Yop makes clear is that World War I had really big and lasting consequences. Empires fell apart, new countries were formed, and the causes of future conflicts were planted. Like when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, it led to the Middle East being divided up in new ways, which still causes problems today.
And back in the U.S., the American Yop talks about this time of paranoia and fear called the Red Scare.
Right. People were scared of the communist revolution that had happened in Russia and worried that communist and anarchist ideas were spreading in the U.S. This fear led to the government arresting people, kicking people out of the country, and even executing 2 Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, even though they probably weren't guilty.
Sounds like a pretty dark time for America. A time when being scared and suspicious was more important than being fair and reasonable.
Unfortunately, yeah. And as the American Yop points out, it wasn't just about persecuting people for their beliefs. In 1919, there were a lot of race riots all over the country, fueled by people competing for jobs and housing, and a backlash against Black veterans who were speaking up for their rights after coming home from war.
It reminds us that even though the war was officially over, the fight for equality and justice wasn't even close to being finished.
Exactly. And when we think about World War I, it's not just about politics and changing borders. It's also about the continuing struggle for social justice, civil rights, and a more equal society.
Wow, this has been a fascinating journey. From an archduke getting assassinated to a global war, a pandemic, social unrest, and the search for peace. It's obvious that World War I was a huge turning point that shaped the entire 20th century.
And the American YOP does a great job of reminding us that we're still dealing with the effects of World War I today. It shows us how fragile peace can be, how important it is to learn from history, and how strong humans can be, even in the face of terrible things.
It really makes you think. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you keep exploring this important part of history. What do you see as the legacy of World War I in our world today? What questions are you still thinking about? Until next time, keep on learning.